This is the Jason Hill Show, and I am Jason Hill. A cabal of man-hating left-wing feminists and their retinue of sycophantic beta male followers have created hell on earth for men and women, and especially for young college students navigating the realm of their burgeoning erotic intelligence and sexual drives. Things have gotten really, really bad. When I was in college and graduate school 30-something years ago, the mantra "no means no" or "no always means no" was becoming coin of the realm in the mouths of college administrators. I had just escaped the sensitivity training seminars and date counseling sessions where students, mostly men, were told what constituted proper dating approaches and rituals. A terrible conundrum had been established. Sexual harassment constituted, quote, unwanted sexual attention, close quote, which could include sexual jokes, flirting, yes, flirting, staring, prolonged smiles directed at a woman, gawking, ogling, and asking a woman out more than once if she had turned you down. Committing any of these transgressions could constitute sexual harassment. It was pretty hard to imagine how one could determine unwanted sexual attention if one were not permitted to flirt or to make a move, so to speak. Most college students were left, as they are today, confused, but somehow the data kept on growing in relation to the number of students from sixth grade who were victims of sexual harassment. America, we were told, was becoming a rape culture. Feminists and administrators made innumerable declarations and posted sets of statistics, one after the other, to reveal that sometimes 1 in every 3 girls had been the victim of sexual harassment. Now, the malarkey surrounding the criteria for what constitutes sexual harassment continues. It is part of a vicious left-wing conspiracy to criminalize men's curiosity, their erotic intelligence, and their creative manner of seduction. For now, I want to reveal the social ineptness of left-wing sexual and social psychology as created by left-wing feminists and their pathetic accomplices, their sycophantic, neutered beta male babbies. But one thing that must be understood before we come to understand the utter stupidity behind the mantra "no means no" and the idea that verbal consent is the only manner in which women grant consent to sex. I shall contend few women ever give verbal consent at all, is that we must consider the social psychology of the two types of persons who have crafted the mantra or the slogan, and who have designed these stringent and stultifying, soul-killing sexual harassment criteria, which includes flirting. They really are, when one thinks about it, inverted sexual perverts who just cannot release their own repressed sexual imagination to the level of even tame domestic farm animals. So what do? They sublimate their repressed desires onto others, the young especially, and these sexual fascists, I think, are borderline psychic pedophiles, if you ask me. You've got to understand these people psychologically, if only minimally, if you're going to destroy them or if you're going to contend with them on a moral level. But all right, the two archetypal figures we're talking about here are the professor type and the moralizer. As both a university professor and an ethicist and a specialist in moral psychology, I know these types intimately. So let's deal with the professor type. This type lives primarily in his head. His intellect is a constitutive feature of his identity. He cannot get outside the obsessive habit of analyzing, critiquing, and then subjecting every piece of claim another person makes to some kind of meaning test. This type has a brain and a mind that need constant challenges because it is a mind that is highly developed. Have you ever heard such people talk about sex, about their children's poop? There is always profound analysis behind the discussion. They are often not the most physically attractive people, so they will gain most of their self esteem from what they take to be their superior intellects, which they lord over average, ordinary folks. The little people, often they talk in highfalutin ways and use words to confuse you, and you sometimes get the sneaky feeling that they are looking down on you. The way to defeat this type is via strong physical confrontation. They are afraid of this, and secretly it excites them in some perverse way. Beneath the carapace of intellectuality, they scream to be dominated physically, male or female, and to be liberated from the burdens of the mind. The professor type is a prime candidate for moral bullying. Afflicted by a deep sense of social uselessness, coupled with a deeper sense of intellectual superiority, he is the prototypical genius trapped in a rotten and unthinking culture. His social isolation is proof of his indubitable uniqueness. That very uniqueness drives him relentlessly to prove his worth in the eyes of those whom he secretly despises and envies. Liberated from a childhood in which, for the most part, his brain power held no special place in the cultural register of his milieu. He watched and watched from the lonely sidelines the brainless and beefy athletes, the savage little goons, who were bound to fail by their own stupidity, he thought, and he watched them rise in popularity, while his own bookish temperament and premature wisdom went unrecognized, not by his parents and teachers, but by those whose esteem he needed the most, his peers. The professor type has never recovered from the trauma of a message he received early in his life from society, and it is this, that his identity would make him socially irrelevant. Like the artist, he is regarded as idiosyncratic, a parasite living on the largesse of a productive culture unless he can prove himself useful in a measurable and marketable way. He retains that dubious title for the rest of his life. In short, he has never recovered from what we may term the trauma of the playing field. Now, let us face it, childhood is judged successful to the extent that it eventually produces an adult who reflects the ethos of one society, especially when that ethos is a sure guide, one should say, to monetary success. The playing field really is a sort of milieu in which one's future position in one's society's cruel hierarchical ladder is first gauged. It is the arena in which worth and efficacy and dominance and respect are set by those who are just as instrumental as parents in influencing self-esteem and values, that is, one's peers. And children absorb a sense of their place in the world and of others' view of them on the playing field. One's position on the playing field sets the emotional stage for one's place in the larger world. Now, the professor type, the prototypical nerd, has never had any status on the playing field, and he has never recovered from that trauma. His sedentary lifestyle derives from his immobility or clumsiness on the playing field, that first forum in which physical endurance, muscular development, and agility are cultivated. And he carries with him a sense of shame that his current life of intellectual devotion is to compensate for. So reparation for painful slights and psychological invisibility are his conscious goal. What he has suffered from most of all is incongruous growth. So while his elders praise his intellectual preciosity, His peers regarded him as a loser, some kind of freak, some kind of weirdo. He was and still is marked as a social outcast, an eccentric who is occasionally called on because of his specialized credentials to comment on something taking place in the world. Sexually, he lags behind his peers. Sexual activity is a mark of adulthood. Last to break his virginity, and more often than not, the one who could never get a date or was left standing awkwardly on the dance floor. Or child intellectual is caught in a paradox. His mind is far above the little goons whose immaturity and childish pranks, the rituals of normal, healthy children, reinforce their own burgeoning independence and contempt for what adults think and say about them. Now, they reinforce each other's emerging sense of self. Several developmental psychologists have argued that at this stage, the peers of children are more central to developing their identities and shifting code of values than adults. But the professor type, late in indulging his raging hormones, but early in marshalling his cognitive skills and energies of concentration, is lauded by the adults for both meritorious models of behavior. So, feeling like a little adult, he is denied full entrance into their world. He's still, for all practical purposes, treated like a child by them. His mini-adult status is more abstract than real. Every exchange depends on a useful currency. His is the pride and esteem of his elders, but it has no value in the world of his peers, who see him as an ingratiating ass-kisser. He is delaying the parental weaning that they are proudly and boisterously celebrating. The little intellectual, for all his skills, is still a child in the eyes of his elders. His astute intellect is not consulted when adults prognosticate about the state of the world or bemoan the depiction of the Earth's rainforest over cocktails. As intellectually mature as he thinks he is, though, he is still a youngster psychologically. He needs the affirmation that addresses his vulnerable status as a child. Although he longs to be an adult and imagines himself to be one, sort of, he is still at the mercy of his peers. He cannot rise above his burning need to be esteemed by them. And despite telling himself that he is their superior, he can't emotionally be conned into believing it. Now, later in life, as he plots his rise in the halls of academe, he will need more than anything else a sense of being esteemed by his colleagues. Even from the ugly losers who have not published in years and are going nowhere, he craves respect. In the case of the child intellectual, even those of his peers who are fond of him and who do not treat him like an outcast still regard him as an eccentric. They sense his fragility and his uncanny perceptiveness. Sometimes they turn to him for advice and special counseling, but he knows that there still is a bridge between him and them, and this mars him for life. He becomes the object of a remark he will hear said disparagingly by some and comically by others later on in his life. That is, he lacks social grace. And he will even refer to himself that way, the chronic party pooper, in his self-effacing moments. Nowhere is this self-deprecation more evident than in the classroom. That place is a great theater for the university intellectual because it is a psychic space in which he reenacts much of the tension of his childhood. Sublimation and reparation are the archetypal themes under which scholarship is deployed. That all this is hidden from his own consciousness is what makes him so dedicated to his task. Teaching is an unconscious way of lording it over people who lorded it over him in the early years. And the student is a psychological stand-in for the goons, the medieval gargoyles, the mindless morons, and the nice little village idiots who ignored, chastised, and in the best of cases were condescending to the intellectual as a child. They are reincarnates of those creatures from the intellectual's past who acted as if they were going places minus the requisite brains. His entire being is a boiling cauldron of unconscious hunger for revenge. Everybody needs heroes drawn from the larger world. The American businessman, the contemporary relative of the rugged frontiersman of a past era, the mover and shaker, the paradigmatic achiever who embodies traits that he lacks and will always lack, is the national luminary whom the professor type is most often contrasted. Academic intellectuals are cognitive ballerinas. Even the stodgiest of the plotters are this. And the professor type knows it. He accepts it. The intellectual has heard it said, he need not conform his ideas to the reality principle that scientists and businessmen abide by. The businessman who fails to translate his grand ideas into concrete action, be it a cozy 24-hour Meals on Wheels company, or just a plain flower shop with free coffee for browsing customer, goes bankrupt or loses a lot of money. The intellectual, inoculated from such life qualifying exams by a system of special protections, knows that his unreadable work in progress will be published and kept in print for several years, regardless of sales or its social utility. The university press bringing it out is subsidized by its home institution. He will produce work that is dry, flat, dull, and dense, but that has all the markings of profundity. The more adventurous postmoderns and so-called radicals will produce clever, inflammatory, rhetorical wordplay that is nothing more than the verbal rants of narcissists who have created an industry among themselves in which each effusively praises the work of the other and ensures that even among the dumbest, there is still a hierarchy of invisibility. These people are the pimps and the whores of the university, the left-wing bastions out of which these nefarious ideas that create policies that kill the sexual souls of men and boys in this country arise. With their siege mentality, they are the academic mafia acting like pious moralists. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll look at the other archetype out of which arises the slogan, no always means no. And I'm talking about the moralizer. And then we'll look at why verbal consent is never ever given verbally. This is the Jason Hill Show, and I am Jason Hill, and we'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to the show. This is Jason Hill. The second kind of sexual fascist that imposes the no equal to no dating formula on individuals is the person that we can call the moralizer. We're going to get to the good stuff, folks. We're going to get to the good stuff of why no does not mean no, usually. But we're looking at the psychological profile of the people who create these slogans before we get to the good stuff. So the moralizer comes across as consistently principled. They are as rigid as a rigor mortisized body in a morgue. They are inflexible, intransigent, implacable, and they brook no contradictions. Their moral self-righteousness betrays an underlying belief in their moral infallibility. They do not engage in philosophical give and take, nor do they need to subject their moral convictions and mandates and imperatives which they impose on the rest of society to any form of critical scrutiny or logical cross-examination. In fact, the mere suggestion of such an endeavor is proof of the moral corruptibility of one who suggests such a breach of what is already known as an axiom. No means no. Flirting and prolonged eye contact are not only forms of sexual harassment to such persons, the moralizers. They can trigger psychological trauma in the women subjected to this iteration of the male gaze. oh yes, the male gaze for these people is inherently damagingly objectifying and eviscerative of a woman's dignity. These are all self-evident truths to the moralizing individuals or the moralizer that warrant no further discussion. So the moralizer is known as, we can call that person a kind of moral tightwad. They are deeply unhappy people with an insatiable void that can only be filled with bromides, cant, and rhetorical plinth. They live for one purpose: to dominate those around them, and more, to remake society into a sexless, drab, flat-lined form of existence where pleasure, sensuality, spontaneity, and living with a sense of the unknown and mystery are all abolished. Their need for absolute moral certainty masks a deep-seated fear of the physical world and of men and their untamable licentious and lascivious ways. Anything salacious between human beings that can lead to new ways of thinking about sex and eroticism must be annihilated, because they do not fit the neat political configurations, these arid mental categories into which all of human existence must fit. They have an inability to adapt and enjoy the messiness of sex and life in general. Well, criticism of their rigidity is met with a steely and cold response. Your effrontery is a putative and deliberate attempt to circumvent the egalitarian and safe spaces, they know in absolute terms how to construct for women. Above all, their goal is to arrest the sexual development of women and keep them in a terrified state by two means. The first is by hiding from women their own unruly, devilish, and passionate sexual nature. Second, by convincing men that masculinity per se is toxic by definition. Any overt expression of masculinity comes at the expense of women's autonomy and sovereignty. I've already mentioned why the notion of unwanted sexual attention is problematic. Now, unless a woman sends a direct signal to a man that she's interested, how is he to interpret those signals with complete accuracy? And based on his sense of the correctness of his own accuracy, follow through without fear of reprisal and rejection. Mutual flirtation, often initiated by men, is the way that the sexual conversation between men and women begin. The moralizers have left unclear what no means when a woman says no. Is it no to sexual intercourse, no to persistent flirtation, no to the leaned-in neck that's aiming for a kiss? Anyway, let's deal with the most explicit case, sexual intercourse. So no woman says, in effect, yes, we may now have sexual intercourse, as a follow-up question by a man who asks if he can penetrate her. So the more likely scenario is that two people have bypassed the mutual flirtation stage and are in bed, and it seems like intercourse is going to be the organic outcome of a lot of plain old intimacy, a lot of making out, and a lot of fondling, a lot of kissing, and so on and so forth, just acts of intimacy. And as the man gets a bit more assertive and she says no. So no, she does not want to proceed any further. Now here is the rub. She could be deadly serious, okay? The guy could just have a serious dose of bad spam breath, or she realized that his member is just too small. She likes something larger, or she's just sincerely lost interest for whatever reason. My point, to be clear, is not that there are not legitimate cases in which when a woman says no, she really means no. I'm going to make the case that quite often no does not necessarily, and in many cases, does not mean no. But let me say this before I continue. That woman in bed with the man with the spam breath, for whom she's lost that sexy feeling, has already given her pre-verbal consent to sex already, right? She has every right to change her mind, as we all do in every sphere of our lives. But in being intimate with the man to the degree she has already allowed herself to be, she's consented. Now, one of the reasons that many women say no when they consciously or unconsciously mean yes is to get the guy to strategically back off so that she can be taken a bit more seriously. There is nothing more anti-seductive than being made to feel that you are predictable, easily available, and a ready-made piece of prey for a man. A woman says no because she wants to send a message on the order of, do not assume that I'm incapable of resisting you, that I can so easily be taken. You need to take your time and prove yourself and try harder to win my heart and my soul. Getting a guy to strategically back off serves several other functions, right? It sends a message to a man that sex exists in the head as much as it does in the body, that the sexual conversation leading up to sex needs to last a bit longer. A woman might say no because she wants to see fulsomely the full repertoire of a man's seductive capabilities, his charisma, his charm, his seductive appeal, all with a view to appraising his capacity to be more than just a stud, but rather a true lover. And it is through the exercise of his erotic intelligence that a woman who says no, but really means yes, is likely to acquiesce eventually. But how does she consent? Most sexually intelligent women, as opposed to these left-wing neutered beta males or dowdy, dowager-like feminists, give consent through a host of strictly non-verbal cues. Sex is almost never consented to by verbal means. The mere invention of the idea by these individuals does not prove that they have zero sex lives. It proves they want to politicize the sex lives of a culture of individuals who have long known intuitive manners and ways of initiating and consenting to sex without the notion of verbal consent being introduced. Consent is communicated through movements of the lips and mouth in highly insinuative ways, movements of the hands and shifting of the head, tilting of the head, and a plethora of body movements that no textbook, right, can describe accurately. Now, these feminist pleasure killers and their beta male accomplices are afraid of the magnetism of the eyes. The eyes and the prolonged stare, the roaming eyes that discreetly accompanied by an ironic smile, or a sheepish grin, or even a slight look of a sense of proprietorship and feigned detachment or controlled enchantment, all scan a woman's body. And the alarming ways in which a sexually neutral body can become highly eroticized and sensuous drives the moralizers crazy. The body must be beaten down into submission. In some ways, women have internalized the vaulted superego of the moralizers. For Freud, the superego was the sort of internalized and codified set of cultural norms and mores. It is one's sense of the idealized self. So it's the domain where your idealized self-image of yourself comes from. It crafts a person in the image of a mandate on the order of the idealized self is that which I'm not, but that which I really ought to be or I ought to become. And the cultural superego is an offshoot of the collective superego of the individual. It is a moral watchdog set up by civilization to achieve and maintain civilizational mandates. So it internalizes civilizational norms and mores and imposes them on the individual. So the superego of the left-wing moralizer in this case is dangerous because women feel guilt and remorse, a consequence of betraying their superego when they violate the demands of the superego. So a woman sits in fear of another part of her psychic personality. This is what Freud would call the id, right? And the id is the seat of the pleasure principle. It contains our sexual drives. It is largely unconscious. It is not subject to laws of logic or reason and has no concern of external reality or what is socially or ethically expedient for the self. It's where our dream lives occur, where slips of the tongue occur, and it is the seat of our primordial and sincere and authentic sexual passions. That's where they lie, inside the id. The id evades the scrutiny of the ego and the superego as far as Freud was concerned. And the id is not available to rational admonishments. So it is equivalent of like a 2-year-old in a candy shop who wants a candy and he wants it now. So truth be told, the idea that all conceptual and conscious access to what we know we want and desire that makes the self immediately available to language, and especially in the sexual realm, is just highly untenable, okay? Our conscious verbal expressions often betray a deeper unconscious truth that lies simmering beneath consciousness that is home to our libido. And it's chaotic and it's unruly. And a woman says no because she's aware of the contradictory nature of her sexual sensibilities and her consciously held values. So let's use a scenario, right? Let's imagine the case of Katerina. Katerina holds an MBA from Harvard and a PhD in Victorian literature from Princeton. She's fluent in 4 languages and she travels the world with her hedge fund manager husband. Their children attend elite French schools, and she hails from a generation of families that traces back to the Mayflower. She's not just a wealthy white woman, she hails from old money, so to speak. She's sipping her morning coffee. Her children and husband are already off to school and work respectively. This morning she's working from home, hosting myriad Zoom calls. She's staring at the butt and muscular body of the Polish worker whose back is turned to her. His bubble butt molds to his body as if the jeans he's wearing were pasted onto his skin. His biceps are huge, as are his hands, as well as the crude knotted veins that form just below his fingers up to his biceps. She's been observing him for the past week as he stands in a large, empty swimming pool in the backyard, repairing the filter and other sundry issues with the pool that she just hasn't bothered to ask about. There's a lot of problems going on with the pool, and he's fixing it. He's also painting it. Now, a few days ago, she invited him up for a cup of coffee. Just a friendly gesture, she told herself. She'd handed him a coffee, and then she'd gone back to her study. But she found herself staring at the low-hanging, thick bulge in his jeans. It seems to have grown a little bit larger when their fingers brushed as she handed him the cup of coffee. Now she beckons to him, right, on this particular morning, making an excuse to ask about how long the pool will take to be functional. She pretends to have not remembered his name. And he tells her his name. His name is Alexander. No, please don't call me Alex, he says playfully, correcting her immediate attempt to shorten his name. Is he being insolent? She wonders. But he has a playful smile on his face. Is he flirting with me? He's flirting, she tells herself. Now she senses her confusion and sense of titillation. Common Polish name, he says. They exchange a few pleasantries. Well, he mostly does by telling her how nice the day was turning out to be. She's actually appalled by the way he talks. He sounds like Tarzan in speaking the English language. Blowing into her mug, she asks him how long he has lived in America. He answers, 20 years. Now she finds herself growing a bit contemptuous, but she also feels herself becoming slightly aroused. He stared at her for a while. He stares at her for a while, and he smiles. An open grin is the type a man commits to when he feels an open attraction for a woman and unabashedly feels his right to display the feeling. She notices that his teeth are slightly crooked, but they're white, they're not discolored, and that there's an obvious asymmetry to his face. He looks like a proletariat. He looks like a worker. The silky softness of the blonde hair on his hands and his arms contrasts with the coarseness on the skin of his arms. And she thinks of her husband's hairless dad bod. And he continues to look at her, but has the grace to break the stare by looking through the kitchen window out at the empty pool and then back at her. Her heart races, and suddenly she wonders if he's fantasizing about having sex with her in the empty pool. Her breathing is growing shallow, and she feels a bit discombobulated. He asks her if she's all right, and he holds her by the elbow to steady her. Her body jolts, and she feels another spasm of arousal that hits her body with a fierce violence. She looks down at his hand, and he removes it. She looks up at him for a long time. Her mind is reeling in multiple directions. How could she be feeling what? He's working class, he's uneducated, he's a bit uncouth in the way he talks, and yet she feels slight nervousness in her eyes, and beneath that slight agitation that she's beginning to feel, she notices that she has turned her body in an almost imperceptible way towards him with her feet slightly ajar. He moves his body closer, and his leg fills the space between her open legs. He lowers his head and wraps his arm around her waist, and their lips meet. Not knowing what she's doing, she parts her lips and their tongues collide. He bites gently on her lower lip and runs his tongue slowly across her lips. He takes her hand and places it on his firm and chiseled chest. She holds the kiss a bit longer. Then images of her husband slams their way into her consciousness. Their impending 15th wedding anniversary comes to mind. I can't, she says. No, I can't. And she's running up the stairs before she knows it. She sits quietly on her matrimonial bed for a while, and then she lies back and she waits. And she waits. What am I waiting for? She asks herself. She listens for any sounds of motion coming up the stairs. She's flushed with a kind of lulled delirium. She waits in hopeful expectation. After about 5 minutes, Katerina closes the few buttons on her blouse. She realizes that she has unconsciously unbuttoned, and she goes to the window. His back is facing her. He's drilling into the walls of the pool with a sledgehammer. Her eyes are a bit moist. She undresses slowly, knowing that even if he turns around, he would not be able to see her now that she has clasped the drapes to an almost full close with just enough opening for her to see him. She touches herself and runs her fingers over the length of her stomach. And then she slumps to the floor. She sits on the bare carpet, brings her knees up to her face, rests her face on the caps of her drawn legs, closes her eyes, and she falls into some sort of trance. Now, what did Katerina really mean when she says, "No, I can't do this," yet proceed to move quickly upstairs with a hope and expectation that he would follow her and do what? Rebutton her blouse? What was she waiting for in her bed, a space normally reserved for sleep and sex? The questions could continue ad infinitum, and the answers would be as ambiguous and open-ended to several interpretations. By moving closer to him and maneuvering her body in such a way that the space between her open leg would accommodate a perfect fit with his leg, had he moved a few inches closer, which he did, does this make her the initiator? Does it? We will take another very short break and have more discussion on why no does not always mean no. when we get back. I'm Jason Hill, and this is The Jason Hill Show. Welcome back to the show. Feminists who berate and lament the tyranny of the male gaze should take note the hard stare of Cassandra, or any number of women such as Katerina, whom we just described, or Elizabeth, or Betty. We could name any endless number of women. There is no gaze more fixed and objectifying of a man than that of the prostitute sizing up and cruising a potential client. Women say no because, as in the case with Katerina, her conflicted feelings about her desires will later save her from retrospective embarrassment if she surrenders, and yet she desires to spit in the face of her conflicted desires, sensing that the conflict is a social artifice her body is rejecting, laughing at it even while her intellect admonishes her. Human beings need psychological congruence quite often to function with a sense of continuity through time. And the compartmentalization that is necessary to act in contradiction to our rationalized so-called values and beliefs becomes too much. In some sense, had Alexander relieved Katerina of the responsibility of having to make that choice by taking her, resisting the no in a gentle manner, had he moved away a little and held her face in his hands and adopted a more serious countenance on his face, told her she was beautiful, and clasped her hair behind her ears, Katerina might have fallen into his arms, resisting her own verbal resistance. But Alexander, knowing the social asymmetry between them, cognizant perhaps of the times we live in when seduction, pursuing the hunt are both ostracized and criminalized, backed off. But let us consider a moment during the kiss if Alexander had asked her if she wanted to go further. An awfully unseductive and unerotic gesture. I contend that the mere question is problematic. To begin with, it places Alexander in the position of being a supplicant, a most untenable position for any respectable man to be in relation to pursuing a woman sexually. But for Katerina to say, after much coaching, to give her verbal, explicit consent puts her in an undignified position. Every decent woman knows that explicit verbal consent is vulgar. It's vulgar. It's vulgar in the sense that the verbal utterance of consent is stripped of all the seductive artifices of sexual play and sexual playfulness. It makes her too literal. She becomes awfully banal in giving verbal consent. There are not that many sexy and erotic ways to give literal verbal consent to sex. There are endless sexy and erotic ways to offer it non-verbally. The minute a woman verbalizes consent, she lapses into sexual oblivion. She's another sexual talking head, a ubiquitous sound-alike of every other woman denuded of mystery, intrigue, wonder, and a capacity to inspire awe, exaltation, and genuine lust in a man. She sabotaged seduction, which is a protracted form of sexual persuasion and conversation that can start days, weeks, months before intercourse. A good hunter, like a good seducer, is self-possessed and knows how to bypass consciousness by plumbing the unconscious mind, heart, and soul of a woman. Seduction on both parts is stylized, masculine or feminine burlesque, an art form that a stylized self executes. Most women realize, I think, on some level, that to be reduced to a talking head verbal consenter to sex that makes them as badly off as a pathetic Islamic woman who's forced to wear a burqa. Only the burqa is visible. They are shrouded in linguistic verbiage by decree of self-righteous moralizers whose sole purpose for arising from their beds each morning is to inflict retributive justice and enact revenge upon men. A self-respecting woman shows deep respect for a man when she says no, but consciously or unconsciously means yes. She's giving the man an opportunity to be imaginative, to conjure up a persona, to learn the rituals of seduction that appeals to women and get outside his own self-absorption. In fact, any man who expects a woman to say yes immediately has either met a woman who wants a quick hookup, which means she's a slutty gay man trapped in a woman's body, or is simply a self-absorbed narcissist who does not realize that in seduction and pursuit, it's not about him at all. It has everything to do with the woman. The more he takes himself and any boring, tedious details about himself out of the picture and place her and her life at the core of the dance, the better equipped he'll be to accomplish two things: break past the no, and also reveal to her, like a good political leader, what she truly desires and wants long before she could ever verbalize it. What was repressed and denied in her becomes overtly languorous and sensual in his presence. Now, women say no when they often mean yes for the simple reason that one's unavailability increases the prestige value of one in a man's eye. An easy conquest for any man, any discerning woman knows, leaves him with a sense of his own superiority and disappointment in the woman. She ought to have made the hunt a little bit more exciting, unpredictable, and even dangerous. A woman's sexual value to a man is proved over and over if he returns to her to pursue her. He's excited more by what is denied him than by what he can easily acquire by a mere grope. A no is always a sign of a potential withdrawal and a deadly insult to a man's fragile sexual ego. An ambiguous no that comes with the body signal of a yes drives insecurity, which motivates a man to work harder at seduction, and in the process proves his masculinity to himself and displays it overtly to a woman. A good coquette, of course, will reassure her male pursuer by assuring him that despite saying no, she still remains one of life's greatest possibilities. That is, a subject of attainment. Now, some women say no because they're simply cold. They used to be referred to as ice queens, and the moniker is apt and still remains appropriate for contemporary usage. These are not frigid women without any sexual desire. They are coquettes who like to see men suffer, prostrate themselves before them like sycophantic babbits, and these women cannot be pursued. They are cold, deliberately cold and withdrawn, seemingly out of reach physically, and distant. To pursue them in the traditional ways of seduction is to invite contempt, because they will laugh at you for being a slave to your desires while they are stoically removed even from their own feelings. Their interest is to prove to themselves that you find them desirable, and you get the sense that you're auditioning for a cold casting director whose emotionless face betrays nothing of what she thinks of you. In fact, the more you look at her, the more you realize the less she thinks of you. This is the most serenely, seemingly self-possessed woman with a self-contained ego. She represents, however, a deceptive facsimile of a self-possessed queen. She says no because it is a psychological strategy she has used all her life as a form of punishment and control. To withhold sex from several men at once drives men into a bloody frenzy, since men are as good as their last conquest, and the Ice Queen neutralizes the battle for conquest even before it has begun. She shuts men down before they can utter a word of compliment in her direction. Her aloofness is a sign of universal contempt for the male sex. Each man thinks he can break her, and that is the mistake. The only way to get such a woman to yield sexually is to treat her with utter disdain and contempt via abject indifference. In her presence, one should act as if she exists, but as an ordinary stand-in for the most ordinary and average of women there is to encounter. In her presence, one should find a woman that matches her regality, her poise, and her beauty, and who opens up to one in a subtle and distinctly female way to one's charms. Do not look at her. Do not make any attempt to find her attractive. Let your indifference seem natural. Let your eyes glaze over her for just a momentary second, as if you just seen sight of a chambermaid sitting in the royal box at the opera, slightly amused, but your eyes moving on to more exciting delights. You're doing all this not to make her jealous, but out of an atavistic need for self-preservation. And she'll have conjurers of placating buffoons around her, pursuing her to no end. But your aim is to isolate her from your consciousness, to elevate your status by raising your own snobbery to the level of a cult. Convince other men to ignore her as well. Command them to resist their childish proclivities for acting like slavish, masochistic, groveling ass-kissers in her presence, which is what fuels her narcissism. The more this kind of naysayer can be isolated, the better it will be for her domestication as suitable prey for the male hunter. If you're absolutely forced to be in her presence for long periods of time, then in subtle ways treat her like one of the guys. De-sex her in her presence and make sure you become the center of attention through your wit, funny stories, and generosity in buying everyone drinks at the table, including the Ice Queen. This woman will never give you verbal consent or any kind of consent. She has way too much erotic intelligence and sexual imagination. But she'll look at you. The look will be an invitation for you to fulfill your sexual, biological destiny with her, the virile, cocky, arrogant top man born to hunt, pursue, and capture. If, as described above, some women say no because they're too cold, well, there are others who say no when their body language screams yes because they are too hot. Literally, these are hot-blooded women who are embarrassed by the whore that lives inside of them. They're flushed, wet, and beside themselves when in the presence of a real masculine man. They want to skip the romance, the foreplay, the build-up to the moment via intimate conversation and just get it on. But they're plagued by a sense of false modesty, either through societal socialization or because an annoying, nasty little superego asserts itself like a hovering schoolmarm. These women just would not feel right about themselves if they went straight for the crotch. Who knows? Maybe they went to Catholic school and the image of the prune-faced nuns and their vocalized prohibitions are just too omnipresent. They bat their eyes, turn their bodies towards the guy, and shake their heads, sometimes almost fanatically. Now, for an inexperienced, stupid frat boy, this is a disaster waiting to happen. But for a man who truly loves women and who is an expert in the art of seduction, this is his dream come true. The goal here is not to neutralize, or diminish the whore inside this woman. The goal is to inflame it by exercising restraint in her presence. Here a man must not appear to be engorged by his own passions, lest she feels overwhelmed by a double affliction of passion. He must, above all, convince her that he sees the woman besides the whore, that he sees them as lined with no contradiction, that the two are not mutually exclusive, as her good faith conscience tells her they ought to be. This woman has said no because anxiety is provoked between her pride and some sense of values she either has or believes she ought to have, and the tyrannical disobedience of her body to those ethical mandates. The mature and seasoned man must show that the integrity of her body and its desires have as much value, legitimacy, and weight as do her consciously held values. Now, how he does this is through intimate gestures, kissing her hand, caressing each of her fingers individually, implicitly asking her permission to go further through glances, eye movements, and head gestures. He makes his moves not by one dramatic, vulgar, and crude move, but by scores of subtle gestures. He opens his palms and looks at her and waits for her to take his hand. And now that she has made a move, the rest, as they say, is history. And all persons with erotic intelligence will, of course, know why. The Jason Hill Show is a project of the David Horowitz Freedom Center and Front Page Magazine. Unauthorized reproduction of this podcast without express written consent is prohibited.